Today is the 15th of October, and we will be discussing the situation on the Orikhiv Sector, looking at Avdiivka, and then at the Oskil riverfront. Let's begin by looking at what's going on to the northeast of Kopani, where over the past few days you've had Ukrainian attacks that were able to yield some minor gains, advancing a couple hundred meters, taking over a trench line to the northeast of the village. But you could see that on my fortification map, which indicates trenches in light green, that there are other layers of defenses that the Ukrainians still need to pass through to reach the village of Kopani. And there's also a lot of trenches that were set up by the Russian forces that are not recorded based on satellite imagery that is overlaid on my map. So basically, in every single tree line, you could expect for there to be a certain level of Russian defenses. Maybe in some areas, it's just dugout. Some areas, it's a full-blown trench that spans the entire tree line. In some areas, maybe it's just a Russian infantry position where you have like a ATGM crew station. And yeah, that's a big part of why the Ukrainians are taking a long time to advance in this region. But nonetheless, in the area that they were able to enter, the Russians responded with their own fire from TOS-1A shelling. And then in this video that I'll click on over here, you can see that the Beaver unit, which is a Russian FPV unit, where they have a lot of drone operators. You can see here that the drone is able to enter the trench that the Ukrainians were able to take over, and it enters a small opening where the Ukrainians were most likely seeking concealment, because from above there is like a concealment thing. It's like a wooden structure that has camouflage. So when the drone is looking from above, it seems like it's concealed, camouflaged with the open field in the region. And so here you could see that the FPV drone hit its targets. If we zoom out for a second, we'll see that the Ukrainian assaults in this region are being conducted by the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, and specifically the 1st and 2nd Rifle Battalions of that brigade. And this unit was moved in from the Pryyutne sector, which is to the west of the Orikhiv sector. So now they're attacking on this new part of the front line. And this unit was engaged in lower intensity combat. So you could expect them to continue attacks in this region for a couple of weeks now, given the fact that they've just been moved in. And Kopani is pretty interesting because we haven't seen many reports of heavy fighting over here throughout the entire counteroffensive, but now we're seeing that this is one of the areas on the southern front with the highest intensity of fighting. So we're going to have to see what comes out of that. Looking further south at Verbove, you'll see here that I changed the unit map to indicate that the main fighting force that's at the forefront of the Verbove sector is the 65th Mechanized Brigade. This unit was moved in to help relieve some of the efforts that were being made by the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which is a Ukrainian unit that was formed specifically for the counteroffensive and has been at the forefront of fighting, especially around Verbove. They were fighting here during the summer, taking over the village, and they have been near Pryyutne as well. So they've been moved out of some of the fighting in this region and replaced by this unit over here. And now we also have a video from the 65th Brigade, which shows their FPV drones conducting strikes on Russian positions, or not actually Russian positions, but Russian infantry that entered a Ukrainian position. So let me elaborate. In this area that I'm marking in the blue rectangle, these are some of the fortifications that Russia built up in anticipation of the counteroffensive. And they are extremely vast. There are tunnels, there are underground tunnels that are connecting them. There's a wide array of trenches as well, dugouts, all of that. The Ukrainians were able to take it over a process that lasted multiple weeks. But in this video that I have marked over here that was released by Ukraine 65th Brigade, you could see that a Russian infantry group is able to enter a part of that trench, the westernmost part of that trench, through this route over here. So they enter and then they're hit by the FPV drones. Now, this doesn't mean that the Russians were able to take it over, but it does mean that they do have the ability to reach that area and disrupt the Ukrainian coordination in that region. Because a big part of why the Ukrainians wanted to take over this defensive position is so they would have positions on the hill on which those trenches are located on. And so they'd have this gathering point where sometimes they could have concealment or cover from Russian artillery and drones, not always. But it would be sort of the staging point for at least infantry, so they can then go along some of these other paths like this road over here and then begin launching attacks onto Pryyutne itself. But if you have Russian attacks with infantry on the flanks, then it makes it very hard for Ukrainian formations to organize and conduct those attacks. Moving a bit to the east, we have a new video released by Ukraine's 46th Air Mobile Brigade. And I'm talking about the area just to the east of Verbove in these open fields. This has been an area where Ukraine has tried to advance for really a very long time, about a month and a half, you could say, since late August, around that time. And the goal for the Ukrainians has been to successfully take over all these open fields and take over Hill 166, sorry, which is a height located over here. Parts of the height are located to the north of the Verbove line, so that includes the anti-tank ditch, the Dragon's Teeth, but most of the hill is located behind those fortifications, including a trench, a manned trench where you still have Russian forward positions. And so you could have the manned trench in this white line over here. And the Russian units, they're still operating in this area, and we have confirmation that they're actually operating to the north of the main trench as well, based off of a video released by the 46th Air Mobile Brigade, which is a unit that's been fighting in here for a very long time. They have not been rotated out yet. Here we have a video of their FPV drones and also their artillery targeting Russian forward echelons in the tree lines, or what remains of those tree lines, because you can see there's a very heavy loss of foliage. Here you can see those are the cluster munitions that's coming from 155 millimeter shells. They're firing onto the Russian forward elements in that region. There may be a trench over there. There may be some sort of dugouts. But either way, it gives you an idea of how the Russians are still able to operate north of those trench positions, which means that the Ukrainians are unable to do any sort of significant advancement into the Russian defenses in that region. Now, looking at the area directly to the west of Verbove, we'll see that the Russians were able to conduct a very localized counterattack. And what I mean is that they were able to organize a small force within the 247th Air Assault Regiment, 2 BMD-4Ms, and they drove along this local road that starts in Verbove and then it goes out. So they were able to reach this area over here, wherever the arrow is located. At least one of those BMDs, I believe, was damaged due to the Ukrainian fire in that direction that was trying to repel the Russian assault. You can see the geolocations for all this over here, but I won't show the video as it is pretty long. You can see over here, this is the path that the Russian vehicles took, and that the Ukrainian trench that they were able to storm is located adjacent to that road. So you had the BMDs actually dismounting the Russian forces in that region. So you had a small amount of Russian forces that got out, and then they began clearing out the trench. And the trench that I'm referring to would be the one over here adjacent to this road. They were able to engage in firefights with the Ukrainian forces that were located within that trench, and the Russians received artillery support in the battle. Then by the end, they were able to capture some positions over there and were able to take 2 Ukrainian soldiers POW. I don't know if this was just a localized raid or if this was a serious attempt to change the front lines in order to gain a stronghold within the first Synkivka line in an area that Ukraine had previously been able to take it over. That I don't know, but either way, this does show that even in an area, the Orikhiv sector, where the Ukrainians are still trying to go on the offensive, still trying to conduct offensive activities, and that the Russians are still on a mainly defensive posture. Really the only area now on the southern fronts where you do still have serious Ukrainian attempts with still many brigades being committed to that region. Despite that fact, even in the sector, the Russians are still able to conduct localized counterattacks, albeit this one was pretty small. I believe the totality of the advance was about 800 meters in total. And now looking at the Velika sector, you'll understand why I said that the Orikhiv sector is really the only area where Ukraine is still putting an emphasis on offensive activities. If we look at the Velika sector, there were 4 Marine brigades that were involved in advancing in this region along the Mykolaivka River. And they were involved in fighting for months throughout the entire summer campaign. They were able to take over, I believe, a dozen villages, or it could be even more in that entire time period. And they were able to advance from the outskirts of Velika all the way to Orikhiv, so that's about a 10 kilometer or 11 kilometer advance. Now those units, understandably, after fighting for so long and really facing a lot of Russian resistance throughout that time frame, having to overcome a lot of fortifications, but not as much as in the Orikhiv sector, they have been rotated out, which is totally understandable after that long of a time. They've been replaced by the 58th Motorized Brigade, so that's at least a infantry brigade that was previously within the AFU, but then you also have a lot of territorial defense units that have been moved into the area, not even full brigades, but just specific battalions that have been moved into the region, and they're now at the forefront of not an attack, because we've not really heard reports of any Ukrainian attacks, and we haven't really seen any footage of those Ukrainian attacks, even with small groups. We're not even seeing that. Instead, the Ukrainians are on the defensive. They have been able to repel Russian assaults onto Orikhiv starting in late September, early October. So that gives you an idea of where the Ukrainians are currently at, their state of mind in this region. And then looking at Pryyutne, this is an area where the Russians are actually able to advance, but at a very small scale level. So if you see over here, you'll see that these are Russian forces, small group advancing along a local road. If we'll zoom in, you'll see they're probably advancing along this road over here. And you could see that there's a Russian tank firing from a tree line towards the Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainian positions are located on the blue marker, and that gives you an idea of where the current front line is, in that the Russians are actively trying to advance in targeting Ukrainian forward positions. The reason why the Russians are doing this is not in order to conduct any sort of major offensive, but it's in order to improve the positional nature of their defenses and of just their positions in general around Pryyutne, because the Ukrainians currently have a lot of their forward echelons in this region in tree lines and around ponds that are extremely close to Pryyutne. You could have small arms fire heading in the direction of Russian positions in the northern part of Pryyutne. So the Russians want to create a buffer zone, which includes open fields in between them, in order to prevent the Ukrainians from launching attacks, even if they're unsuccessful, in the direction of Pryyutne in the future, because the Russians want to use Pryyutne as a forward operating base for the forces in the region. And so you could see that the natural dividing line would be this specific ravine, where you have two different tree lines that are running adjacent to it, parallel to it. And part of that, Russia's already been able to take over, and other parts the Ukrainians are still holding on to. Moving on to Avdiivka, you'll see that there have not been any confirmed territorial changes since the last video. We do have reports from the Ukrainian side, especially mentioning the very, very high amount of shelling by the Russian forces all around Avdiivka, but in particular of the coke plant. Here you can see some of the shelling that the facility experienced today from an aerial view. Despite reports from some pro-Russia Telegram channels of advances in the direction of Verbove, I can't really find any video footage to indicate an advance that could be geolocated to the area around that village. What I do see is that yesterday, at least, there was another attempt by the Russian forces to organize a column of APCs and of tanks, and then you'd have the troops being dropped off, most likely at the tree lines, the windbreaks running adjacent, parallel to the actual rail line, and then from there they would try to enter Verbove, but there's no footage of that. What we do have footage of, and I don't show it just because I don't want to get demonetized, but you can click on the link. You have the 110th Mechanized Brigade, Ukrainian unit that's been defending on the northern flank of Avdiivka for a while, but they've been at the forefront of the defenses for the past 5 days. They were able to repel the Russian column and cause some direct hits onto the units of vehicles over there. You could see FPV strikes, you could see artillery shelling, including, I believe, with cluster munitions in this area. You do have some Ukrainian forces that were given DPICMs in this region, although it's more present on the southern front and around Bakhmut. And you also have a large presence of landmines in these open fields around here. And of course, the issue with the fields in this region becoming more swampy over time. And we now have additional elaboration on the situation around the slag heap, which has been heavily fought over by the Russians, heavy battle since day one of their attacks in this region. Here you can see that the Russian 114th Brigade, which is a part of the DPR's 1st Army Corps, it's a unit that's been engaging on the northern flank. They're a big part of Russia's attacks in this region. They launched an ATGM onto a Ukrainian firing position at the northern part of basically the top of the slag heap, but it's in the area facing north, so we know that the Russians don't even have a foothold within the slag heap. If this video is recent, which I believe it is because I only saw it being shared starting today, what you could see is that the Russians are able to fire onto the slag heap within the range of ATGM, so they are still pretty close to it, but not actually within it. So that's going to be a big target for the Russians going forward. Looking at the area to the north of Soledar, there is a very minor change of the front line that I made in the area around Mykolaivka, which is a frontline town, and it has been for a very long time since it was taken over during Wagner's campaigns in the areas around Bakhmut. What you can see is that the Ukrainians made some extremely small positional gains And we've been seeing them slowly chipping away at the Russian positions in this region ever since the Wagner Group left the entire sector. What you could see is that they were able to advance south of Avdiivka, take over those open fields. But this is, again, over the course of months, and I'm talking about an area that is like spanning a couple hundred meters. So that should give you an idea of the scale of the fighting over here, that it is using very small forces, and that those small forces are only able to advance basically from one patch of fields to another over the course of an extremely extended period of time, because this is not really a priority for either side. These are just positional battles. And lastly, looking to the north of Kupiansk, even Ukrainian sources are reporting the movement of large amounts of forces in the direction of the front line to the north of Kupiansk. They're saying that there's a large troop concentration building up in the region, and this could be backed up. We see that there's a lot of different Russian units in the region, especially this one over here, 138th Motor Rifle Brigade, and then you also have the 25th Motor Rifle Brigade. These are some of the ones that have been involved the most, and you also have the 6th Army and a lot of the units within that army of the Russian Federation that are involved in the fighting in this region. But in terms of actual gains, I can't geolocate any. What we do have is a specific video which shows some Russian forces, which may be from the 35th Motor Rifle Brigade, that were advancing along a path, most likely in the direction of Synkivka, but you can see they're still in a rather forested area, so I believe it would be in the area in between Liman Pershi and Synkivka. And so yeah, that's really all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.